You're listening to the Speaking Tongues podcast. I'm your host, El Charisse. Each week, I sit down to a conversation with multilinguals where we discuss and celebrate language, life, and culture through our own perspectives. Episode 93, Speaking Latin American Spanish. Hello, language lovers. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Speaking Tongues, the podcast and conversation with multilinguals. This week, I bring you episode 93 and a lovely chat with Mauricio, who joins me to talk about his language of Latin American Spanish. Now, we've covered Spanish as it's spoken in a few different countries, but since Mauricio is quite the traveler and has lived in several places, we're talking about the broad topic, which is Spanish as it's spoken in Central and South America, Mexico, and the Caribbean. In this episode, Mauricio tells us about his upbringing between Argentina and Peru. We talk about some of the variations that exist in Spanish, including the 3 geographical blocks that share similarities and why Chile and Argentina can be considered outliers to the rest. We talk about the uniqueness of Chilean Spanish, and Mauricio gives us some examples for us to hear these variations. He tells us about his career translating for media, including movies and television, and explains some of the changes that technology has made in the field of translations over the course of his career. We also have a chance to learn about some of the things he's observed about Spanish spoken in the US during his time traveling throughout the country. Big thank you to Mauricio for this fun conversation and for taking us on a journey through Latin America. If you enjoy this episode of Speaking Tongues, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the Speaking Tongues podcast on Apple Podcasts, and like and subscribe on YouTube so that other language lovers like ourselves can find the show. And if you've been a longtime listener of the show or even a recent listener, you can now support the show on buymeacoffee.com. Links to all platforms are in the show notes. Okay, let's chat. Welcome back to another episode of Speaking Tongues. I'm here today with Mauricio. How are you today, Mauricio?
I'm fine, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to your show, to your podcast. I feel glad that we can actually and finally meet.
Me too. I feel like we've spoken a lot on social media, so it's nice to get to really sit down and chat with you and talk face to face and learn more about what you do. I like to start each episode with the same question, and that is, what is your first language and which languages have you learned to speak?
Well, I'm a native Spanish speaker. And well, since I was a little kid, I was exposed to English from an early age. I went to some bilingual schools, and so my languages are English and German because I majored in English and German. I went to I did translation studies, so I'm working every day with Spanish, English, and German. On top of that, when I was younger, I studied French and Portuguese. So I think I'm at the B2 level in those languages.
Oh, wow.
And then, yes, I was curious enough to start to learn some Russian after I left high school, which was a long time ago when the when the former Soviet Union was still a country. So there were some opportunities for high school students to apply to some scholarships so that they could start undergraduate studies in the former Soviet Union. So I needed to learn some Russian first, and that was a plan. But unfortunately, that very year, 1989, everything crashed and the Berlin Wall fell. So then I thought, like, well, it's not a good idea to go. Then, but I reached, a decent A1, almost A2 level. And then I was curious enough to explore a bit with Mandarin and Italian and Greek lately, though I cannot say that I speak those languages. But overall, I've been trying to learn as many as possible. in the last many years.
So as Spanish is your first language and
It is. Mhm.
you've lived in a number of and traveled throughout a number of Spanish speaking countries in Latin America. Um, Tell me some things that you've noticed about the Spanish that, well, let's start because we didn't say where you're from or where you grew up in Argentina, correct?
Yes. And well,
Okay.
that's an interesting question because I grew up in Argentina and also I grew up in Lima because of family reasons. We were moving back and forth. And then my father used to be a sociologist, and he was assigned to some missions for literacy programs in the whole of Latin America.
Mm-hmm.
And then because of his job, we had to relocate very often.
Oh,
So
okay.
every time I don't clarify this about my dad, people tend to think that I was the son of a diplomat or something like that. But no, I wish, but no. And thanks to that, and because of that, I got exposed to different varieties of Spanish and also different aspects of the Latin American culture.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
Tell me what some of those different aspects are that you've observed as you went back and forth between Argentina and Peru and even in some of the other places that you've traveled and you've lived in.
Yes. Well, I relocated in Chile about 9 years ago. That's still supposed to be my base. I was living in Mexico for almost a year, some years ago, and I'm planning to come back to Mexico. Um, so I would say that many of the times when people perceive the Latin American culture, they tend to think like, oh, well, everybody should be like the culture in Mexico, but that's not true.
Hmm.
It's a very complex scenario in terms of varieties of the language, in terms of the culture itself, the arts, the history, the ways of people. But if I dare to categorize, I would say, okay, there is like Mexico and Central America. It's a block. The Caribbean culture is a different block. It's like, for example, DR, Venezuela, Colombia. They are sort of more Caribbean in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And then there is like the South American block, except for Chile and Argentina, because Chile and Argentina are very different from the rest of the countries in many
Huh.
ways. In many
Okay.
ways. Uh-huh. So the question was what similarities there are among all of these countries, right? Well, first, the language that is a great plus. I always say, like, if it wasn't for the um, the political scenario and the financial crisis in some of the Latin American countries, we will probably be a great continent because we have the plus of speaking the same language, you know.
Right.
But at the same time, I think it is an interesting experience that we are similar, but at the same time different. You know, similarities we were colonized by the Spaniards, so they brought a lot of the Catholic influence, um, and some aspects that are not very, I would say, I'm not very proud of, like colonialism, feudalism, and these, culture clashes, like,
Mm-hmm.
sorry, social classes,
Right.
and the constant, like, um, trying to show that some groups are more important than the others, especially those, more European looking, tend
Mm.
to be richer and more important and get the most opportunities than the non-European looking.
Mm-hmm.
That's like the standard thing.
Right.
So that's something we have in common.
Mm-hmm.
And also we have in common that there is a French word to describe this, and they call it the joie de vivre, which is that, like the spirit, the joy to live. Like, okay, it doesn't matter that we have corrupt presidents or or economies are falling apart or things like that. We're always, willing to dance and to talk and to enjoy the sun. And in many of the countries, we're lucky enough to have like long summers, and we can find the same varieties of fruit along the year.
Mm-hmm.
So life does not seem to be so harsh in
Right.
terms of the natural conditions, the natural environment.
Mm-hmm. The first question I want to ask you is in terms of the language that's spoken among these different places, have you noticed the language changing? And I guess in terms of, I'll put it like this way.
Mhm,
When I went to Argentina a couple of
mhm,
years ago, and I don't speak Spanish very well. I understand Spanish sometimes. It depends on the context, right? But I had no idea that the words that I had been using for certain things are completely different in Argentina than they would be in Colombia or in Mexico or in another Latin American country. So I guess what I'm asking is, as you've traveled, have you had to navigate those sort of differences between the ways that you communicate, the words that you use, and maybe gestures or any type of things that facilitate communication? Are they drastically different from country to country?
mm, they might be drastically different uh, between block to block, like I described the three blocks. And this is not something academic. What I'm saying, I mean, I'm not basing my opinion on some academic paper I've read. I'm just trying to figure out my own hypothesis.
Yes.
So there is Mexico and the Central American block, the Caribbean block, the South American block, and Chile and Argentina. So the differences might be more visible between the blocks in some ways, yeah, in terms of the
Mm.
language. Yes, like there is a very popular TV show that is from Mexico, and uh, it started in the mid 70s or so. So every Latin American child has seen it. It's called El Chavo De Locho, which depicts the story. You've probably seen it, right?
Maybe I've seen it.
It depicts a story of a poor 8-year-old boy who's actually the character is a small boy, but the actor was already 45 years old when he played this character. So they live like in poor, I would call neighborhoods in the central part of Mexico City, and that show was so popular that we have adopted a lot of um, inside jokes, language, and many, I would say, uh, interesting things in all Latin American countries. So that's one thing that standardized many of us in many ways, right? So since there are 120 million speakers of Spanish in Mexico, I would say that's the largest variety of Spanish that most of us would understand. So if you go with, if you learn Spanish and try and speak Mexican Spanish, you'll be understood everywhere.
Hmm.
But comparatively speaking, Chilean Spanish or Argentinian Spanish are different. So you might face some difficulties if you're not used to the rest of the varieties.
Mm.
And yes, there are some weird things. For example, there are like 20 different words for pen, depending on the country you're using the word, which is crazy, in my opinion.
Really?
Yes, really. Like in Argentina, we call them virome or lapicera. In Chile, it's called lapis pasta. In Peru, it's called lapicero. In Ecuador, it's called esfero. And then every country has a different word for the same thing.
Oh.
And it also happens with the pieces of clothing, like, well, a camisa, like a shirt, is standard for most of the countries, but the word for t-shirt varies. Like in Argentina, it's remera, in Chile, it's polera, in Peru, it's polo, and in other countries, camiseta. And then you will find many different terms. I don't really know why, but my guess is like since many of the countries, well, all of the countries already had their native languages. I think there was a mixture of the Spanish term and the native influence. in many of the colloquial words. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I can't think of English having like 20 different words for pen, for example, depending where you say it, right?
Yeah, I think there are some things I can think of in the US that are regional and people say in different parts of the country, but
Right.
not really something like one I can think of
Hmm.
and you may have heard it in your travels is hero. So in New York City,
Hmm.
we have the hero sandwich, right?
Correct.
It's a for people listening, it's a long piece of bread and it has meat and cheese and veggies and it's a sandwich. It's a sandwich. It's maybe
Sure.
about like I don't know, a foot long, maybe less than a
Hmm.
foot depending on where you're going. But if you go a little bit further south to Philadelphia from New York City, they call them hoagies.
Hmm.
If you go to certain parts of Pennsylvania, they'll call them grinders. If you go up north to I think maybe in Boston they call them grinders, but um some parts of the country they call them subs, like submarine sandwiches. So
Hmm.
that's just an example that I can think of because I love sandwiches.
Yeah, me too.
Coca-Cola or soda is another one. Like we call like
Right.
Coca-Cola, we call it soda. Some people call
Mhm.
it pop, some people call it Coke. Coke, they call it Coke. Even if it's Pepsi, they still call it Coke because
Right.
they've just taken that name. So I mean those are
Mhm.
just two examples I can think of, but I notice
Mhm.
in Spanish and Latin America, like you said, with the pen, and
Mhm.
shirt it changes a lot. So for you going between Argentina and Peru, did you have any kind of hassle with that and with things changing, or how were you able to navigate the differences and the little things, the nuances between Argentine Spanish and the way it's spoken in Peru?
I think the most struggles came when I moved to Chile
Mm,
because the language there, Chilean Spanish is unique in many different ways. And I'm saying this for good, for worse. Though it's happened more than a couple of times when I said something and people had no clue what I was saying, though I was using the word that most of the Spanish-speaking countries will use for something specific, and they didn't understand what I was saying. And then, actually, my very first experience, but we'll get to this point in a few minutes, I guess, as a translator, because I studied, I did translation studies. Actually, my very first job as a translator was with a Chilean company. They had an import-export business in the southern coasts of Peru, and I was lucky to be hired to do telephone interpretation and then to translate some legal documents back in the late 90s. And because we got along, really well, and they were very kind to me. And I remember the first time I was invited to supper. Um, I was sitting at the table with, the two managers, their children, and they were all speaking Chilean Spanish. And I was like moving, just moving my face from one side to the other side, not understanding much of what was going on. And it was shocking because it was my language as well, but it
yeah.
was so different that I was getting roughly 50% of what was going on. Uh-huh.
Whoa.
Yes. So I would say, how do I navigate that? There are some things I have learned to do, and there is a very interesting theory. I can't recall who wrote it, but the name is the uh, communication accommodation theory, CAT, right? So sometimes you converge or diverge, or you maintain, depending on how you want to be perceived. For example, when I take a taxi, an Uber, and it's driven by a senior Chilean man or someone about my age, I don't want to be perceived as non-local. I mean, I can blend very easily, but so I just try to imitate the accent, the way, some sounds that I will normally not do, just because I want him to feel comfortable. Because Chile, in a way, has not. well, right now it's different, but let's say people my age or older, I'm 48 right now, we're not actually very exposed to foreigners. Immigration was not a thing. So they might still feel awkward about immigrants or expats, and they were not used to that. So I don't want to cause this awkwardness, in the moment. So I just, go with the flow. Though, but if I'm speaking to someone younger, like someone in their 20s, I will use my own accent, my own variety, because I do want to be perceived as different in a way.
Right.
Most of the times it has not been a problem to get to communicate. Um, or to get my message across. But I do have some funny experiences, with some particular terms meaning something really opposite, or with some verbs. This is funny. For example, in many of the Spanish-speaking countries, the verb coger, it means to grab something, to take something, except in Mexico and Argentina, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I still giggle a bit when I hear coger, because to me it means something very different. And I can, or if I'm trying just to, to be funny, I would just, like underline the word, say like, really, do you mean that? What else?
See, I learned that when I started this podcast, someone was telling me about the difference, and I was like, oh, I've heard both of those words. I mean, I've heard that word used in both ways, but it never occurred to me that it was one way in Mexico and one way in you said Argentina, but
Argentina, Mexico use the same meaning for coger, which means like to have sex,
mm-hmm.
and it's rude to say that.
Yeah.
While the rest of the countries, the meaning is just to grab something or to
Mhm.
catch something.
Yeah.
Like you can use it to take like to catch a bus, to catch a train, to catch a taxi, right? But you don't say that verb in Argentina or Mexico. And I always say this, don't say that unless you mean it. So it's very peculiar, and there are some interesting terms too. Like I remember back in the 90s, it was some experience, because this was the time when technology started to be more massive. Like for example, when people, like regular people, started to have internet in their homes, and that was
Yeah.
my case. Before that, it was not a thing, and it was so uncommon. So I remember I started to use some voice chats we had, like back then, like IceQ and another one. But anyway, I connected with a very nice lady from Mexico, and by then I had never been to Mexico. And then I was talking about something, that I think it was like in winter, and I said like I had to put on a jacket, which in Spanish, in all of the countries except in Mexico, means chaqueta. That's the word, right? So, and then she just laughed, and she couldn't stop, and I didn't understand what was going on. Then she said, "You know what that means in Mexico?" I said, like, no. And it had a sexual connotation that had
Oh.
never occurred to me. So, and then I thought, well, yeah, you might want to be careful with some words, but then again, if you say something, people will realize you're not a local and you're using a different variety, and that'll be fine. But for some terms and some specific verbs, you might actually mean something very, very different.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I will say, if you learned like standard, and by standard, I would probably say Mexican or Colombia, you'll be fine most of the times.
Mhm.
But it's the subtleties with certain terms, with the idiom, that might either make you not understand what's going on, or you might perceive as someone like using careless language. But it depends on where you are.
Right.
Like Argentina is also an island. Like it's very funny how the average Argentine person calls the rest of the variety of Spanish there is a term, we say neutral, to speak neutral, like, oh yeah, for example, this show, because of the huge influence of Mexican television programs, now children are speaking neutral, and many parents are not very happy with that because they feel like their Argentine accent is being lost, right? Because of the
Right.
neutral influence. But it's funny because, first of all, neutral accents do not exist, but we call neutral, and they call neutral to any variety not using vos as the second person singular pronoun, and using tu instead, which tu is you. But for the rest of it, it's not really a problem. I mean, drastic differences, no. But I would say if you go to Chile and you studied standard Spanish, you might not understand what's going on at the very beginning. I always tend to compare, Chile to, I mean, Chilean Spanish probably to the English spoken in the north of England, which is the same language, but it's pronounced so differently that at times you might be confused.
So, do
No.
you think that it's the pronunciation of Chilean Spanish? Is it the pronunciation and the vocabulary? What exactly do you think it is that made it, especially when you talked about being at that party? What made it difficult at that time that you weren't able to pick up more than 50%?
One of the every language has distinctive features. For example, one of the most unique features of English is that English has incorporated terms from many different languages, and unfortunately, most of them have kept their original or approximate pronunciation, which means that there is little logics between written English and spoken English, right? In other words, it's hard to master English pronunciation from the very beginning because the rules to pronounce the sounds are very obscure in a way. But Spanish is all the opposite. There is like a 95% correspondence between written and spoken. And one of the most unique characteristics is that we pronounce every single vowel and consonant, and there are very few exceptions. Chilean Spanish defies that because, to start with, it tends to drop the last syllable in many words. They use a different conjugation for the second person singular, and many of the final S sounds are not pronounced. And on top of that, they have incorporated a lot of local idioms to instead of using like the regular common verbs. So, but I would say like the most difficult part is like foreigners might be, or even Spanish speakers, other Spanish speakers from the different regions get confused because we don't hear that regularity of pronunciation with syllabic, and every syllable should be pronounced. That is something that Chilean Spanish is different. So I would say that's the most challenging part.
In the time that you've been living in Chile,
Uh-huh.
have you picked up any Chilean speech patterns?
This is and also this is a very interesting question as well, because my Chilean friends say I definitely have a different accent. I'm not Chilean at all, but when I come to Peru or Argentina or anywhere, they say, "Oh, you have some traces of Chilean accent." And of course, I should have some because I've been living in the country for 9 years. I mean, all of my interaction, I would say almost all of my interaction with Spanish speakers in Chile is with Chileans. So uh, you're listening to the language and all the time, and there might be some patterns of intonation or maybe some words, but I do think I do not use Chilean words at all, or try not to, unless I want to be, I want to on purpose, blend. but for the rest of them, no,
What
not really.
is what is maybe one word or one phrase that you could
Mhm.
use that's very, very Chilean?
Oh,
If you want to
um,
blend in, like what's a go-to phrase you could use
mhm.
that you could try to fool people a little bit?
Right. One of my best Chilean colleagues, I'd say best because she's very smart and helpful. She said to me when I first arrived in Chile, she said to me, "Don't try to fool people with Chilean Spanish because that's impossible." And I replied to her, "Are you kidding me?" She said, like, "Yeah, try it. You'll never get it." And I think that's true. Though a shortcut could be, for example, for anyone learning Spanish or even at the basic level, at the A1 level, you know that the to conjugation has like AS for AR verbs, like for example, tu hablas, and then you have ES for ER and IR verbs, like tu comes, tu vives. So if you want to try to play Chilean, you just replace AS for AI and you say hablai. For AR verbs, you go I instead of as. For example, tu hablai, tu trabajai, tu tomai, tu estudiai, and then that's
What? I love that.
That's very, very Chilean. Yes. I mean, a regular Chilean, a normal Chilean person will always say that and will never go as. I mean, unless they're trying to be perceived as very formal. But in a regular conversation, they will go to hablar, to estudiar, to tomar, to cantar, etc. And for the AR, IR verbs, they just go E. For example, they say tu comí, tu tení, tu podí instead of tu tienes, tu comes, tu puedes, which is very mind-boggling, you know.
This is
Uh-huh.
advanced level Spanish.
No, actually, no. You know what?
For
When
someone like me who's very on the basic level, like this is
uh,
like another category for me.
Yes, but since I've been teaching Spanish for many years, actually for 18 years now. I always when I have students willing to or actually living in Chile and whose purpose is to interact with other Chileans, this is lesson number one. I said to them, yeah, this conjugation tu tomas, tu cantas, tu hablas exists, but not in Chile. In Chile, everybody will go this way, and unless you understand that, you'll be really confused. So
Yeah.
you better at least understand that this is the way people are going to speak, you know?
Mhm.
Another thing is this is difficult to master. They add an extra syllable to at the end of a sentence, which is po, po, which is po, which is a very short form of pues, which means like well. It's a filler actually. It's like saying well, but at the end of the sentence, right? For example, but you should not use it in every sentence because that would not be normal. But when you're trying to make a point, then you go po. For example, somebody asks you, ¿Por qué no fuiste al cine? No, why didn't you come to the cinema? You said like, well, I didn't have money. Well, I didn't have money, right? You could say, well, no tenía plata, po, at the end, right? Or
Mhm.
because I was tired, estaba cansado, po. No? I know I'm not saying it in perfect Chilean accent, but that's a distinctive feature. That's a syllable that Chileans will use to make a point at the end of a sentence, and it's very, very typical. Mhm.
Wow, I love that. That's
Argentines do
adorable.
that in a different way. Because we use like the word and, but at the beginning of a sentence. So instead of saying porque no tenía plata, people say y no tenía plata, and
Hmm.
that's well, I didn't have money, you know.
Oh, okay.
Uh-huh.
That's so cool.
So I sometimes, to make it easier for say the Canadians, I always say, well, it's like your huh, eh, at the end of a sentence. A, right? Something like that.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Do those differences show up in the work that you do? So if you have something that's going to a Chilean client, or it's going to a Mexican client, or Argentine, like how do those differences show up in the translation work that you're doing? Or do
Yeah,
they?
that's a yes. That's crucial question for every translator, especially for those of us working with audiovisuals. Like every translator, hopefully, will specialize um, in some field. Some of us do legal. Some of us will do financial or audiovisuals. For example, pharmaceutical. It depends. Well, I do audiovisuals like subtitling for films and documentaries. Also, now and then, legal and financial. That's my field. It doesn't happen with legal or financial, or because those terms are standardized for most of the countries. Say like a budget is a budget
Mm,
anywhere, right?
right,
Or a
right.
loan is a loan. But this is what we call in translation, there is a term and that has developed more, I would say, scientifically in the last few years. And it's become more and more important right now. And translators, I mean, good translators do not take it for granted anymore. We call it localization.
Mm,
Localization means you have to know what the purpose of the text is or the materials, where it will be shown or distributed, who will be the audience, and what language variety will be needed. And this is very important. So this is one of the first things that you, as a translator, need to ask your client, So should it be localized for, for your country, say Mexico or Argentina or Spain? And considering that, then you will start using, the variety as close as possible. Um, but I mean, I have been to Madrid, but I have not lived in Spain, so I wouldn't do localization for Spanish from Spain because I would feel like I do feel like I don't know much about that.
mm.
So I would definitely just give it to a colleague of mine if that was the case. Yes, you need to take that into consideration. Um, and funnily enough, in terms of audiovisuals, there are like it's very when you listen to a adapt version of a film, like an American film that was dubbed into Spanish,
Mm,
and there are three possibilities. Actually, two of them, either the Spanish version, or what they call the Latino version, and the
mm,
Latino version is the Mexican version.
mm.
So for every single film dubbed, I don't like dubbed versions. I prefer subtitles. But if that was the case, there is the version dubbed in Spain and the version dubbed in Latin America. And the version dubbed in Latin America is almost always Mexican
Hmm.
because, like I said, it's 120 million out of the 450 million Spanish speakers. So that's
Yeah.
20% of 25% of the people. I
Mhm.
think that's fair enough. And in the past, it's not being done much right now because of the financial crisis in Argentina. I guess interpreters do not want to accept low offers, or they moved. I mean, good interpreters just moved elsewhere, or good translators are living elsewhere. But in the past, Argentina was a good, it was the place where dubbing was being made. So
Mm.
there used to be another dubbing made in Argentina for the Argentine market. Not surprisingly, the three biggest industries in terms of films and television are Spain, Mexico, and Argentina. And also because they are the more mature markets. They started with making films much, much earlier than the rest of the other countries.
I see.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Uh-huh. Now, also, for example, Chile has always faced this problem and situation because of the variety. If you have a film that depicts people, regular people speaking like locally, it's hard for the rest of the countries to understand what's going on. So I think this is one of the reasons why Chilean there are good Chilean films, but many of them just stay in the country, are not shown elsewhere, which is sad. Mhm.
Yeah, that is really sad. Now, how did you decide that you wanted this to be your specialty? How did you get into audiovisual
Oh,
and what do you love about it?
well, like I said, I started learning English when I was small kid, and I was not fascinated by languages at the time because when I was a kid, I was more focused on music. I can play the accordion. I went to music school for 4 years, and this is what I wanted to do when I was a small kid. I wanted to do music professionally. But then I remember there was a show every year. I cannot recall the name of this man. He was on television, and he used to do the interpretation for the Oscar awards every year on local television.
Oh.
Yeah, and I could hear, like the original version behind his voice, you know, and I was intriguing. I was interested, and said like, well, maybe I would like to do that. That was the very first time I thought about it, you know, and but I had no idea whatsoever of what the training would be like. And then by the time I was in high school, I started learning a bit of other, like I took up French, which was not obligatory, but I wanted to learn it. I was good at it. And I remember my my mother signed me up for a French class after school because she couldn't put up with me at home because I was so impatient, with I was trying to do something else. She said, okay, I'll sign you up with French in French. And then it was a bit of German and a summer school. And then I thought, well, this is what I want to do. And I just, many people think like some of us have a gift for languages,
Mm,
but I don't see it as a gift. I see it as a passion, which is different. A gift is something that you receive from God and which you're given, I would say, like something supernatural. But that's not the case because if I have to recall how much work I had to put into language learning, I would say it's been thousands of hours. It's been there were times, especially when I was learning, maybe not with French, but when I was learning German, that I felt stupid and well, I didn't cry, but I had to
I
sit,
did.
I had to sit, at my desk and grab a dictionary. And I'm talking about the times when we didn't have the internet
Mm,
or word reference or we couldn't access to things so quickly as
I
today.
remember, yeah.
So I had to grab a dictionary. I had to grab a pen and start doing translation, a lot of translation. Had to memorize a lot of irregular verbs, make mistakes. So I thought I already had an advantage because by the time I was applying to college, I was already functional in English. I had already learned some basic German. So I thought, well, it's not gonna be painful, with the languages per se. But I thought, well, this is something like I feel comfortable with doing and something like that I feel passionate about. And I thought like it was. I still had the image of this man on television, doing the interpretation for the Oscar awards, and I was naive at the same time because during my what do you call it my freshman year, I used to think like, well, maybe someday, I'll be good enough and work at the UNO or some
Mm.
place like that, but I wouldn't do it now. It's too much stress. I would hate it. Sorry, no offense.
Since you
Mhm.
have been in the translation business for such a long time and you have noticed it change from when you had to get the dictionary to now, I'm sure you have many
Yes.
tools to your digital tools to your advantage.
Mhm.
um how has it gotten better for you? How has it gotten worse for you? Or neutral, maybe just how is it different in general, in the way and the manner and the ease and the speed at which you're able to do your job.
It has absolutely gotten better, and I think it'll be getting better and better in time, because now we have online tools and we have quick access to so many sources. We can interact with other colleagues. For example, if I'm translated something from English into Spanish, and I come across some idiom or phrase that I've never heard or seen, and even though I've been, exposed to English enough to try to figure out some things, there's still some things that some expressions that have to do with cultural aspects, or maybe they are reference to someone who's really popular in some region in the US, but have no meaning whatsoever in the rest of the country, let alone in South America. You can easily ask a colleague, right now, or check on sources like Urban Dictionary, which is great. And these things didn't exist, when I was at university. You just had to rely on your many dictionaries, but then there was a lot missing, and some things I can think we were more accurate right now in many ways, and we get to be more. We get constant feedback from other colleagues, but the tools we're using right now are much more reliable and essential. It's much faster what we're doing right now. There are some tools we call CAT, like computer assisted translation, and it's not Google Dictionary, just in case. No, not at all. But it's something more sophisticated than that. Basically, you just put the text in there, and you have a database with words related to the field, but you need to supervise that. You need to double check everything before you deliver, or before you hand in what you have translated. It's not the same thing, to translate say a transactional letter from between two friends, or and translating say divorce paper. There are some technicalities that you need to consider, and the register of the language, and finally, localization, because some things are called differently, even in legal or financial. For example, in Chile, let me think of something. Something simple. In Chile, the word for to rent an apartment, to rent property, is arrendar, right? While in the rest of the countries is alquilar, right? Alquilar, and in Mexico is rentar. So it's three different words meaning the same. So if I translate from English into Spanish in Chile, I need to use arrendar or arrendamiento or anything related to arrendar in the papers. Because if I get to use alquilar or rentar, I might be the document itself might be rejected because it's not what the court or the government office might object to it and say, well, what is this? What are you trying to say here? Yeah, so it's made our lives easier in many different ways. Yes. Though, and on top of that, the only chances you had by then, like 30 or 40 years ago, when you were working with languages, was either, living in the country where the language was spoken because of the exposure, or just having someone, a native, and relying on them. That was your first-hand, would say, reliable source of information. But apart from that, not a chance. And luckily, this is the not so cool part about translation. Well, our profession, our work is still considered as non-essential in many ways. And many people say, well, why should I pay a translator if I can use Google Translate, or if I can use this online translation tool? Like I said, well, it's like, it's up to you. I mean, it's something that if you want to have professional work, you need to pay a professional. If you want to do it by yourself, that's fine, but don't expect it to be accurate. Don't expect it to be reliable, and let alone if you're trying to, if you're going to use the documents or the material for professional purposes, you might be, it's not a good idea.
It's
Mhm.
not. I'm really championing translators, and I think that the work that you all do is irreplaceable. Um, and technology, I hope people realize it makes your jobs easier, but it doesn't replace you and doesn't replace the work that you do, because we need translators. We need you guys.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do.
So as you've traveled around the US, and
Mhm,
as you know, a lot of people here speak Spanish.
mhm.
What are some observations that you've had about the way that Spanish is used here, either by native speakers or by people who have learned the language, or even people who haven't learned the language but maybe have proximity to it?
Right. Well, I must confess that every time I go to the US, I try not to be in the Spanish speaking areas because one of my purposes is to use my English, in the
Mm,
US. But still, depending on depending on the city, of course, I mean, you can tell I'm a Latino. So people, even when I speak English, people will respond in Spanish if they are Latinos too. It's fascinating that depending on the state or the city, it's Spanish speakers from different parts. Like, for example, in New York City, it's mostly Puerto Ricans and Dominicans, mostly. There are Ecuadorians as well. In Florida, a bunch of, Cubans, Dominicans, and from elsewhere. And while in California, it's mostly Mexicans, Central Americans. Overall, I would say something that I observed that is particular is that for those Spanish speakers who've been living in the U.S. for a while, they tend to start speaking their Spanish more nasal. English is spoken like backwards and like here and nasal, right? While Spanish is more like this. If I was trying to speak Spanish with a more Latino accent, I will probably be speaking like this,
mhm, mhm. So it's very
So
forward.
exactly, it's
Okay.
so that's one of the main differences. So even when they're speaking Spanish, they use this position of their tongue or their organs, so to produce these Spanish sounds, and that is something peculiar. I can understand that because when you are, surrounded by speakers of other language, like my case, like when I live in Chile and listen to Chilean Spanish all day long. Well, not right now, but in the end, I might, use some sounds, even though I try not to, but one way or the other, it will happen. So that's one thing. The other thing is like, it seems to me like, especially um, for those not working in the academic environment, for for those not working as professors or maybe, yeah, mostly professors, I guess. They tend to start breaking the syntax of Spanish and try to force like the English syntax into their Spanish,
Hmm.
which is interesting. There's a very popular show on I think it's Telemundo. Well, there's a Cuban attorney presenting cases in Spanish with other Spanish speakers in the U.S. And when you listen to them speaking, you can tell that they're not using Spanish in a Latin American country because their syntax gets broken and tends to be, I wouldn't say simplified, but sort of um, repeats some of the English position of words. Um, yes.
Hmm.
Uh-huh.
Do you have an example?
Yeah, of course. For example, when they use the word back in Spanish, is normally like without context, it's atrás, right? So if they say, I'll call you back, they go, te llamo para atrás, which in Spanish means nothing. I would probably, the correct meaning, or the normal or the regular meaning, the regular translation would be, te vuelvo a llamar o te llamo más tarde. That you wouldn't go, te llamo para atrás. I've seen signs, in New York City with the word furnitura, which doesn't exist in Spanish, instead of furniture. Yes. Or, for example, mopear, which is like to mop the floor. Yes. So their syntax has a very strong influence of English.
Interesting. So I want to give you a chance to tell us about Babel Solutions and tell us about a little bit about what you do, and if you want to share anything that you're working on or anything you want to promote, and let us know where we can find you on social media or how we can get in touch with you for translations.
Thank you. Well, Babel Solutions is my little consultant agency that started about 12 years ago. It's been through a couple different names, but it's been Babel Solutions since 2013. I came up with the name because of a biblical reference about the Babel Tower, where people were working a tower and they wanted to get to the sky, and then God got mad and everybody was speaking a different language, right? So, so what we are doing and I'm doing is provide with solutions for anyone needing to overcome language barriers. So mostly we're doing Spanish, German, English, though there are some services we can do with French and Portuguese. We work in teams, and we are doing language consulting for any needs. For example, if you want to improve your copywriting, or if you need some translation work done, and if you need language lessons as well, if you're relocating in a different country and need to improve your language skills, you can contact me or my team on my social media, which is babelsolutions.org. That's my website, which needs to be upgraded, by the way. I'm on Instagram, showing a bit of my trips, cultural insights, and some hints of language learning as well, and on the email. So maybe it's very simple. It's Mauricio, Mauricios, Mauricios at babelsolutions.org.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I will add your information into the show notes for this episode so that anyone listening who wants to get in touch with you can just click and reach you right away.
Thank you. I really appreciate it, Elle.
Of course. I really enjoyed this conversation with you, Mauricio. I like to end each episode with the same question, and that is, do you have any jokes, tongue twisters, cool slang words, idioms, words of wisdom, or words of advice in Spanish to share?
Well, yes. I would like to share this joke. Actually, it's funny. In Spanish, there are some words that might have multiple meanings, right? And believe it or not, one word it's very controversial. The Spanish word for wife is esposa, right? Esposa. That's a wife, which sounds very similar, like spouse. And then if you want to make it plural, it would be esposas. You just add an extra S to the word, and then you mean wives,
Okay. Esposas.
Well, esposas. Yeah, it's still frowned upon in many countries to have esposas, right? But anyway, funnily enough, the word for the standard official word for handcuffs is esposas.
What?
In Spanish. Yes. Like when you get arrested, hopefully
Yeah.
not you. Okay, the police officer comes and puts you esposas here.
Get out of town.
I'm serious. So you can tell the many jokes we have about that.
Wow. I never knew that. I wonder, do you know? Well, now I'm really curious. Like, do you know the root of that word? Like,
They
where?
must definitely have the two different roots from two different languages. Maybe
Mm,
I can't remember. I can't recall the story, but I'm sure one of them comes from Latin and the other one from probably from Greek or Arabic. But no way they come from the same root.
that's wild. That's so. I'm gonna look into that.
It is, huh?
Shame on you,
Yes.
Spanish. How dare you? I want to
Mhm.
thank you again, Mauricio, for this conversation.
My pleasure, Elle. Thank you so much for this invitation opportunity. And I can say you're doing a great job by, spreading the word, this spirit, this, community. Language learning is, like I said, a wonderful experience. So thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you, for bringing me here.
Of course. And before I let you go, don't think about it
Mhm.
too hard. In this situation, after we've been talking and getting to know a little bit about one another, what is the best way to say goodbye?
In Spanish,
See.
well, we can simply say, uh, oh, in Chile, they use a nice phrase. They say que estés bien, which means please stay well or stay fine, right? Most of us just say ciao, ciao,
Ciao.
which is also from Italian, right?
See. Yeah.
Uh-huh. But I will say hasta la vista, baby.
Hasta la vista. Mauricio, hasta la vista. And I will be talking to you soon.
Okay, thank you, Elle. Goodbye.
Bye.